Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen speaking. In this vlog, I want to challenge a couple of ideas in the Three Principles community. These are a couple of notions that I think Sydney Banks and the teachers and students in the Three Principles world quite simply have gotten wrong. So, there's this idea of childhood worshiping that's very common in the Three Principles community. The child worshiping and the myth of the noble savage. I'll start out by quoting a very well-known and respected teacher of the Three Principles, Jack Pransky, who says that all we are is peace and love with the power to create the illusion that we are not. Now, this is a beautiful quote. It's a very attractive belief, but is it really true? What's really the basis for this? When I listen to Three Principles teachers, when I've gone to seminars, when I've read books, it's very hard to escape a book that doesn't talk about the notion that we are already perfect, that we are already bathing in perfect mental health, that our nature is one of love, peace, and wisdom. Um, and again, it's a very attractive idea. It's also an idea that philosophically has taken roots uh, among many people, especially on the political left in the Western world. You have philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France who very much pushed the idea that kids and infants were essentially, untouched and pure, and that it was society that corrupted them. Society and especially private ownership and capitalism. So there's also a notion here, not spread that much, but this idea that the noble savage, who lived in the natural environment, was likely extremely peaceful and one with nature and living in harmony. And that the only corrupting influences, so to speak, are personal thinking, that we essentially are this godly, divine, loving energy, but there's this small self in here that does personal thinking and that has the freedom to think up whatever it wants, and that uses that freedom um, to make up a lot of misery. And that if only we could see that, we would essentially be bathing in the love and peace that is our nature. So there's a few things to challenge here. Now, first of all, did you know, statistically speaking, that the time period where more people are the most violent is at age 2? So more people are more violent at age 2 than at any other time. Now, this is a quite interesting finding. And if you look at kids and you look at childhood, the science strongly supports that most of us get better over time. We get less violent. There's less temper tantrums. Uh, the fact that we learn to reason and the fact that we get socialized has a tendency to make most of us better in the sense that we're more peaceful, we're less violent, um, we are better able to deal with life, so to speak. So if statistically more people are the most violent at age 2 than they are after the corrupting influences of society, what what does that say? What does that say about this cherished notion? There is quite a bit of research being done in child psychology these days, and there is some evidence that supports the idea that our nature is fundamentally good. And one of the ways that you can check out Paul Bloom's books, for example, for some science on this, but you have these experiments where kids get to watch, young kids, but before they have any language, they get to watch these people or cartoon characters who perhaps climb a wall or, do something. And then one of the characters, may sabotage or pull the other one down. And what the researchers notice is that most of the infants, most of the kids from that point on, will fix their gaze on the one who has been wronged and break out into a smile when and if the person who has been wronged wins. So there does seem to be some innate morality, an innate sense of ethics, and an innate goodness. That is true. But there's also heavy tendencies towards tribalship, being tribal, and towards really identifying and being kind towards our in-group at the expense of the out-group. And this is one reason why kids can be so very cruel, and one reason why at least quite a few adults get more civilized as they evolve, quite simply because their in-group gets bigger. They can identify with and see the humanity with more and more people. So that is something to consider as well. Now, if there's also something else here in terms of the noble savage and people of old who lived in their natural environment. There's quite a bit of research that points in the direction of showing that we are, on balance, more peaceful, less violent, and more intelligent, at least in some ways, that we have ever been. So, for example, today in the UK, the homicide rate is about 1 person per 100,000 people. In the United States, it's 4 or 5 out of 100,000 people. And then you have places like Honduras, where I think you have 90 out of 100,000 people, which is a extremely violent place. But still, it does fade compared to, for example, the Kato, which were indigenous people in California in a couple of hundred years ago, where you had, I think, approximately 1,450 homicides per 100,000 people. You have anthropologists who have visited and studied tribes in Brazil, in Papua New Guinea, and other places that show that quite a few of these tribes that live the way that life was lived thousands of years ago are very much violent and hostile, and not necessarily the noble savage that many people, especially on the radical political left, has promoted. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be tribes somewhere that have lived very peaceful existences and who may be closer to that ideal. May be true. I'm not an expert on that topic, and I may be wrong, but there is also quite a bit of data to support that quite a few tribal indigenous people who live under those circumstances were not very peaceful. and loving. So there's often this idea that, the intellect and science and reason and Western society and capitalism is somehow bad. However, if you're going to put down reason and thinking, then you're also kind of putting down the source of that thinking. So, anyways, if you look at claims commonly made about, for example, racism and sexism and oppression and imperialism in the Western world, okay, you can make those claims. There are truths to it. But what these folks very often don't mention is that it was actually the Western world who abolished slavery. Slavery was common pretty much everywhere. It was the Western world, the liberal world, that abolished slavery. And they often don't quite mention that it's in the Western world where women and minorities enjoy rights and privileges that they don't enjoy anywhere else. And we can talk about inequality and oppression all day long, but of course the truth is that the people who are poor in the Western world are still a hell of a lot richer than people in various communist, utopian societies and various theocratic regimes. And I mentioned this something as a side point, just after having attended quite a few live events, live seminars. I noticed that the jokes are usually at the expense of science and reason and Western civilization. And the criticism is directed in that direction in terms of promoting individuality and then the separate self and stuff like that. And I notice that very few of the jokes are directed at the communist hellholes of the world, or the theocratic dictatorships around the world, whose rhetoric is very much one of collectivism and unity and sacrifice and the divine. So something to consider there as well. Now, getting back to this notion that our nature is one of peace and love and happiness exclusively, that's who we are, and that everything else is kind of illusory. Well, it's a bit like when people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau make the claim that, it's society and culture that is the corrupter of, these essentially perfect children. But it's a very hard argument to make because I mean, where does that originate? I mean, how could you have a society full of corruption and oppression and violence and hate if these capacities weren't easily accessible in human beings? Now, in the 70s, there was a primatologist called Jane Goodall who made a horrific discovery. She loved chimpanzees, which are our closest ancestors, genetically. And she discovered that they could be murderous. They could literally tear each other apart. And she noticed that they were extremely tribal and that they were involved in intertribal warfare. Essentially, these bands of chimps, mostly males, would scan the borders of their territory. And if they came across other chimps, Even chimps who used to be part of their group but no longer were, and they outnumbered them, they would mercilessly torture and kill them. It would literally tear each other apart. And it took a long time for Goodall to report these findings, because if that's our closest relative, I mean, if our closest relative can be that murderous and that vicious, what is, you can't blame that on human influence or capitalism or oppression or any of these things. It has to say something about the nature of the chimps. Well, since we are the closest relatives, so to speak, to the chimps, is it realistic to think that our nature is exclusively one of peace, love, and happiness? I mean, it's a very attractive belief, but is it really true? Probably not. Probably not. So violence also seems to be part of our nature. I mean, violence is easy. I mean, this is likely, again, a strong reason as to how it could be that 2-year-olds are statistically the most violent group of us. It also may be something to consider for those of us who are into self-inquiry, and for teachers who guide other people to see through the illusion of the permanent and separate self. There's very often claims made that if we only could stop all our self-referential thinking and see through this self-illusion, then we would be completely peaceful and completely happy, and none of this could ever occur. While I think there is much merit in that argument, I also strongly suspect that it's not a complete argument. Again, the chimps likely don't have a sense of being the thinker of their thoughts, or being the captain of the ship, or being the experiencer of the experience. They likely don't have the notion of a stable, separate self and a lot of self-referential thoughts to kind of bolster up that illusion. But they're still violent as hell. So again, what does that say about our nature? Now, I think that we are better off if we are willing to look at research findings that challenge our beliefs and challenge what we want to be true. I mean, as I said previously, these are very attractive beliefs. I would really like to believe them. I would really like for them to pan out. And while there may be partial truths there's quite a bit of evidence that many of these claims just don't add up. And then the question becomes, what do you do? I think ultimately spirituality and science is about the same thing. It is a quest for truth. Whether you can discover that truth or not is kind of a different topic. But a quest for truth, wanting to discover how stuff actually work, and doing one's best to kind of slice away the bullshit and to challenge the bullshit as one sees it. Also opening for the idea that we may be wrong. We may be wrong on quite a few things. So back to this childhood worshipping. the idea that kids have perfect mental health, and essentially, if only we could be more like kids, everything would be fine. There's this idea that the kids are one with their environment. They're enlightened, so to speak, to use that word, because there are no linguistic distinctions. There's no thought process to carve up the world and impose these linguistic categories on the flow experience of me and you and past and present and all these sorts of things. But I think what the three principles folks really miss in this regard is that there's a huge difference between unconscious unity, meaning an infant, like for example, my son is 5 months. He doesn't know his thumb, so to speak, from the carpets. In all likelihood, there's no distinction. So there's kind of a unconscious unity, so to speak. But there is a strong difference between a unconscious unity based upon not having the ability to make distinctions versus a consciously experienced unity based upon spiritual insight or late stage ego development, for example. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. If you look at 2-year-olds, 2 and 3-year-olds, and their temper tantrums, you'll see that these kids are fused with. They don't have any perspective on their immediate perceptions and impulses. So as an example, let's say that you have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who comes downstairs and mommy offers him to join her to bake cookies. And then dad comes along and says, do you want to go with me and work on the farm or go with me, in the truck to do some errands in town or something like that. Now, as any parent who's had young kids have discovered, the kid might say yes to dad and then go with dad to the truck. And then once the kid is in the truck with dad, the kid screams, or is very, very sad. And dad might ask, what's wrong? And they say, I wanted to be with mommy. And then you might say, well, why didn't you say that? And then you bring the kid back to mommy. And then there's a new outburst, I want to go with dad. And there's this, and these kids are completely fused with that one perspective. They have no capacity to reason about it. Now, his or her older sister or brother, who might be 5 or 6, may get the same offer from their parents, but they're not likely to do the temper tantrums, because what they can do, that the 2-year-old can't do, is that they can reason about the two perspectives to some extent. So what the 5-year-old might do is to attempt to negotiate with dad that perhaps he could go to town a little bit later so that she can make cookies with mom first. That ability to reason about these perceptions and impulses offers a lot more choice. It's a bit like if you take 2 young kids up in a plane, for example, the 3-year-old might say, look at all those small people down there, and literally mean it. And the 6-year-old sister might say, you're such an idiot, they only look small. Now, they look small for the 6-year-old sister as well, but she's able to reason about those perceptions to some extent. So she's able to have enduring categories, meaning she's able to have enough of a perspective or reasoning capacity about those perceptions that she can see that they only look small, but they're not really small. This is a huge developmental this is a huge developmental victory. This is also why, you can't give very young kids credit for not lying to you. It's not like if you take a very young kid who doesn't have the capacity, and this is a flaw I think many three principles teachers make, is let's say, for example, that very young kids don't lie. Somewhat older kids begin to lie. Now, I think it's a huge flaw to then say that look, the young kid was honest and had perfect mental health, whereas the somewhat older kid has been corrupted by society and has begun to lie. No, most likely not. When your kid starts lying to you, that's actually a developmental victory, something to become enthusiastic about, at least partially. Because to be able to lie, you have to be able to make some distinctions. You have to be able to make the discovery that you can know something that someone else can't, or that someone else might not know something that you know. It's like, before you have that capacity for differentiation and perspective taking, there really is no lying in that sense. You have to have that capacity to be able to lie. It's a bit like when many teachers talk about the resiliency of kids, that they might get caught up in low moods and thinking, but that they snap out of it a lot quicker. Like they don't ruminate about it, and that's evidence that kids are, more mentally healthy than adults. But it's a bit like giving a person who's blind a lot of credit for not being a thief. Or it's a bit like giving a very young kid who can't make the distinction that he or she may know something that someone else don't know credit for not lying. I mean, if you're going to hang on to thoughts, and if you're going to ruminate, which kids don't do in that sense, you have to have the ability to create these distinctions in your mind of a future and make it part of your present experience. You have to do that to be able to plan and to be able to imagine various consequences. Now, this capacity of taking an imagined future and making it part of the present moment is a requirement for rumination and a lot of anxiety and a lot of ways of depressing and stuff like that. That's true. But it's also the requirement for organizing and planning and executing goals and doing those sorts of things, being able to weigh future consequences and delay gratification and stuff like that. It's also the basis for being able to do a lot of stuff that you have to be able to do to be functional in the world. And the kids can't do these things either, the young kids. So it would be very unfair to blame them, for not being able to do that, because they just don't have the capacity to do it. So are you already, I'll put enlightened in quotation marks, I don't like the word really, but are you really enlightened, as a kid? Is unconscious unity the same as what meditation masters have been pointing their students towards for millennia? Is the unity of the infant the same as what people may experience to various degrees after having had a meditation practice for a long time, or as a result of late stage ego development? Is it the same? I will argue no. It's markedly not the same. And here's why. And I'm just going to take a quick detour into developmental psychology. At any point in our evolution, and this is of course also a model, so don't take it too seriously, but at any point during our evolution, we seem to be subject to some things, and we seem to be able to take other things as objects. So by subject, I mean being fused with something, viewing the world through a particular set of filters. These are the ideas that have you, the assumptions that have you, so to speak, because you have no perspective on them. Versus object means what you can look at, what you can have a relationship to, and thereby have more choice about. So for example, the kid who looks down from the plane and says, look at those small people, is subject to his or her perceptions. The somewhat older sibling who's able to say, no, it only appears that way, is able to take those perceptions as object to some extent, to reason about them. So there is a huge difference between not having the capacity, not having the language, not having the conceptual system to make any distinctions at all, versus being able to make them and see the illusory nature of it, at least to some extent. That, and having them as tools in a functional way. So for example, one capacity, very important in adult life, is to be able to do what you could call I-you sorting, being able to sort between my assumptions, my opinions, my experience, my motives, and your experience. To be able to say, look, when you say that, I'm hearing this. Is that approximately a match with what you're saying? Being able to make these sorts of distinctions really is kind of a prerequisite for living in something that's at least supposed to be a democracy, and to be able to negotiate differences in a relatively free world. So from a developmental perspective, you could say that a large number of us are somewhere in the transition between a so-called socialized mind and a more self-authoring mind. So someone who operates from a socialized mind is subject to the cultural norms, perhaps the family religion, the cultural surround which he or she has been brought up with. It's easily my country, right or wrong, or this person can't really have relationships so much because his or her sense of self is made up of relationships, meaning some idea about who I am and who I think significant others think I am kind of blend together into this sense of self. So I'm essentially made up by my relationships. Now, a self-authoring mind begins to take these things as objects. It's the long journey of taking a step back from one's own culture and upbringing and the ideas and belief systems and values one has been raised in, that cultural surround, and developing one's own inner authority, one's own ability to reason about and make distinctions and kind of have one's own take on these things. Seeing, at least to some extent, the arbitrary nature of these cultural conventions and how they're essentially made up. Now, the next developmental journey is being able to take that inner seat of authority as object, beginning to take a step back and look at the process of selfing, our own identity, who we think we are, to be able to take a step back and kind of see how made up our own identities, our own personal authorities, our own sense of self, to be able to begin to see the selfing process, so to speak, is the next kind of developmental phase that some people are involved with. So being able to, through meditation, through contemplation, to begin to watch the process of selfing, and to discover that there is no permanent or stable self in there. There's no selfing process separate from the thinking process that makes it up. This is what the Buddha thought. This is, of course, an insight you can have. It's a discovery that you can make, and it's something that you can see more and more deeply. I mean, from quite intellectually to in quite profound ways, where it really is transformative for how you act in the world and how you experience what we call the world. So being able to see, for example, that a process of selfing and seeing the illusory nature of it, but perhaps also seeing that it can be a tool, that these notions can be useful, it can be used as tools in the world. Seeing the illusory nature of it, but being able to relate to it somehow, is a very different place than the unconscious unity of the child. If you meditate and you kind of lose the sense of a center, and there's just experience, there's just process, and the thinking process slows down enough that the sense of self doesn't get recreated as quickly moment to moment, that experience of unity, where you can see that it's essentially just process, and that the process is distinct but not separate from the consciousness in which it appears, again is quite different from the mental life of an infant. So just throwing this out as ideas to have a discussion. I think the three principles, community and then the students and the teachers, would be a big advantage to challenge some of the bullshit. A very good friend of mine, Jules Lalonde, who has a strong science background, recently did a conversation with Nick Bottini, and I made the point that how a community reacts to dissenters, how they react to a serious dissenter like Jules, who's a very sharp guy, very knowledgeable, very strong science base, who wants to learn and engage, says something about the maturity and the psychological health of a community. And it's also something of I think the three principles have a lot to offer to humanity. That's why I care to do this. So, but I also think it's something of a red flag when there aren't really much dissenters and much disagreement in a particular community. So I think we're all better off if we can challenge some of the notions and eliminate some of the bullshit when the evidence is so strongly pointing in another direction. So anyways, hope this was useful. Thanks for listening.